Hello, everybody. I appreciate you reaching out and finding this presentation in advance of the public involvement meeting scheduled for April 24th. The intent of this presentation is to give a little bit more of an in-depth technical review of what the analysis that has been done since the last time we met back in December of 2022, so that we don't have to spend time doing that during the actual meeting on the 24th. Again, my name is Eric Merriam, and I'm the one of the project managers for the study, and we'll be talking today about an update for the Alawai Flood Risk Management General Reevaluation Study. So, do want to briefly go over the study background and objectives for those folks that may have not been involved since the initiation of the study. Again, we'll give an update on the formulation, evaluation, and comparison of alternative plans. Updates that have happened since last time we met back in December, leading up to a description of what we're calling the prospective plan. And I do want to talk a little bit about the National Environmental Policy Act process and what that means for our study and what the remaining actions are for that process. And then finally talk about ways to provide feedback both in advance of and then following the April 24th meeting. So just again, for those of you who may not be aware, a quick history of the study. There was an original feasibility study that was completed back in 2017. This study led to this study made a recommendation of a project that was subsequently authorized for construction back in 2018. After it was funded for implementation, they got into the detailed engineering and design work and realized that changes needed to be made to the authorized project in order for it to function as it was authorized. Those changes were documented in the engineering documentation report that was completed in 2020. A subsequent validation study in 2021 looked at whether or not those modifications were cost effective and economically justified, and found that they were not. And so that the plan would not be constructed as kind of laid out in the engineering documentation report. Instead of cutting the study completely, the Army Corps of Engineers decided to execute a general reevaluation study to take a fresh look at the problem, starting from square one, essentially, not being constrained by things like having to look at the 100-year flood event, constraints that were present on the previous iteration for the engineering documentation report. So again, we're in the middle of that fresh look now. I don't want to go into too much detail about the study area. I think all of you are well aware. Our study area is the Alawai watershed on the island of Oahu in the state of Hawaii. It is a very densely developed watershed. There are 200,000 residents approximately that live within the watershed. It's 19 square miles and encompasses the Makiki, the Manoa, and the Palolo streams, all of those draining into the approximately 2-mile long Alawai watershed. The watershed is extremely important economically to the state of Hawaii. You can see all the statistics there with respect to contributing to the gross state product, number of jobs it supports, revenue, visiting, and so forth. But we know that this study doesn't just focus on any one area within the watershed. It is a watershed study, and so we take equal consideration, or we have equal consideration for all areas in the watershed. Those areas include, just to highlight, 39 schools, 2 universities, 53 parks and recreational areas, and then a number of environmental resources, 28 federally listed threatened or endangered species. Downstream of the canal, there's 2 marine managed areas and 1 national marine sanctuary. I mentioned all of that because all of that feeds into our study objectives. So the first objective, again, because it's a densely populated area, is to reduce life safety risk associated with direct inundation of structures and infrastructure. The second is to reduce economic damages, again, with direct inundation of structures and infrastructure. And then the third, understanding that this is an important area with respect to commerce and tourism, is to reduce impacts of flooding to commerce and tourism and the associated economic impacts. So the video here we've shown in the past. Again, I'm just going to highlight here because the nature and characteristics of the flooding ultimately drive kind of the reasoning behind the application of certain management measures for each of the alternatives. And so I'm going to play this and just kind of stop it at key points. So you can see this is the 50-year flood event. And as flooding progresses, you can see that it initially kind of emanates from the Alawai Canal and the Makiki stream. Pretty soon, and in just a moment, we're going to start seeing areas, key areas where, again, in other areas where the stream jumps its banks, and that we can apply management measures to try to reduce risks associated with. And so a few of those areas, I apologize, a few of those areas are up here along the Kanaha Ditch. Flooding kind of jumps the bank along the Kanaha Ditch and goes down to the Ala Moana area. And again, along the Makiki Stream, just near the Makiki District Park, kind of again jumps the bank and goes down to the Ala Moana neighborhood. Along the Manoa Stream at the Woodlawn Bridge, the stream jumps its banks, flows down through the University of Hawaii, and ultimately ending up in the Makalimo-Ili'ili area. And again, we have flooding kind of coming out of the Manoa-Palolo Canal. And so all of this to say is that the Makalimo-Ili'ili area receives flooding from the Makiki Stream, the Manoa Stream, the Alawai Canal, and the Manoa-Palolo Canal. And then we have flooding along the Makiki Stream within Waikiki, emanating from the Alawai Canal, on the Mauka side of the golf course coming from the Manoa-Palolo Canal, and then again up along the Manoa Stream and the areas associated with the University of Hawaii because of the Woodlawn Bridge. So again, that's kind of drives the basis of why the plans were formulated the way they were. And we have talked about plan formulation in detail in a number of public meetings. Specifically, we talked about the initial array in public meetings held in July of 2022. We talked about the final array in public meeting held in December of 2022. So I encourage everybody to go back and revisit those recordings or presentations to kind of revisit that if you would like a little more detail. So I'm really going to kind of go over it fairly quickly here. The first step in the plan formulation process is to identify management measures or actions that can be taken in specific areas in the watershed that can reduce flood risk. The study team identified a total of 224 measures. We identified some internally within the project team, as well as through public meetings and tools like the crowdsource reporter that we have used in association with you all throughout the study process. We also incorporated all ideas that were generated under previous iterations of the study as well. Again, all of that totaled 224. So we had to somehow, we had to screen all of those measures and figure out exactly, which ones needed to be moved forward in the plan formulation process. And to do that, we looked at all 224 measures with respect to first, whether or not they're kind of engineeringly feasible, and second, whether they were compliant with USAID's policy and guidance. Those that kind of met those two criteria were ultimately assessed with respect to their efficiency, their effectiveness, so how well they reduce damages, life safety risk, and so forth, acceptability and environmental effects. So after that screening analysis, we were left with 30 measures that were ultimately taken into the plan formulation process. So initially, as presented back in July, we had 9 plans in the initial array. So those plans are detailed in the table that you see on the right. They included a no action plan, a storage plan, a conveyance plan using existing infrastructure, a conveyance plan using flood walls, a conveyance plan using a secondary outlet, a plan that incorporated tunnels, so like the SWIFT tunnels, a plan that focused on implementation of natural and nature-based measures, things like watershed management, decreasing impervious surfaces, a hybrid plan, so a plan that kind of took pieces of those previous plans, and then what we call a non-structural plan. Non-structural measures in this regard are measures that do not modify the nature of floodings, things like elevating homes, flood-proofing businesses, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on that in a subsequent slide. So we had all of those 9 alternatives, and then we needed to evaluate those and figure out, were they effective? Were they cost effective? Did they reduce risk and meet our study objectives? And so we evaluated them with respect to a series of criteria that are listed there under bullet 4. And after we evaluated them, we basically went through a number of iterations for each plan and said, all right, are there modifications we can make to this plan or other ways we can look at these different features to make them more effective or more efficient? So you can see the number of iterations that each plan underwent before it was either screened out or passed forward. Ultimately, we retained 5 alternatives, and those 5 alternatives are those in the table that are highlighted green. And they represent the no action plan, the storage alternative, the conveyance through flood walls alternative, the hybrid alternative, and the non-structural alternative. And so I'm going to kind of walk through each of those on subsequent slides. Again, we did detail those in the meeting in December, and so you can go back to that meeting for a greater, on the website for a greater in-depth discussion of each of them. So what I'm going to do today is basically just talk about the measures in each alternative. And so under alternative 1, the storage alternative really focused on maximizing storage through utilization of existing green space. So we looked at storage areas in the Alawai Golf Course, the Manoa Valley District Park, and the Makiki District Park. When we're talking about storage in these parks, really we're looking at levees around the parks. And here we're again assuming about a 6-foot levee height, again to create a much greater amount of storage in those spaces. Again, allowing those green spaces to be used in the manner that they were prior. It would just be a multi-purpose detention facility where during flood events they would be used as storage. In addition to the storage areas, we had a series of flood walls along Woodlawn Bridge, the confluence of the Manoa Palolo streams, the Manoa Palolo Canal, kind of just adjacent to the Kaimuki High School, to kind of prevent flooding on the Malka side of the golf course. And then the Kanaha flood wall, which is essentially an association with the Makiki District Park. I mentioned that the height of the berms for the storage areas were 6 feet. Again, the height of the flood walls are currently also assumed to be 6 feet. Those heights will be optimized, meaning that we'll look at kind of adjusting it either higher or lower, again, to maximize those net benefits in subsequent study or in later portions of the study. So the second alternative in the final array was conveyance through flood walls. This plan was much more focused on flood walls. And so again, we had the Woodlawn Bridge flood wall, the flood wall at the confluence of the Makiki and the Palolo streams, flood walls along both sides of the Manoa Palolo Canal, and then flood walls around the Alawai Golf Course and the Alawai Canal. We have the Kanaha Ditch flood wall in association with the Makiki District Park as well. The hybrid alternative, which is alternative 5, essentially tried to kind of take bits and pieces of the previous alternatives to maximize risk reduction to the best that we could. Again, so we have components of storage. So the detention areas at the Alawai Golf Course and the Manoa Valley and Makiki District Parks. We also have flood walls at the Woodlawn Bridge, at the confluence of the Manoa and Palolo stream, and then along the entire Manoa Palolo Canal and around the Alawai Canal. So all of those alternatives were detailed in the December meeting. The only one that was not was alternative 6, which is the non-structural alternative, because we were still in the middle of those analyses at the time. Again, just to kind of reorient everybody to what non-structural measures are. They're measures that, again, do not modify the nature of the flooding. So things like elevating homes. So the top picture on the left here shows a home that's essentially on stilts. Elevating the first floor elevation above the floodwaters essentially prevents floodwaters from entering that house and causing damage. That's typically done for residential structures. For non-residential structures, we generally undertake what we call dry flood proofing. This is where you put something like a waterproof membrane around kind of the lower portions of the walls externally, as well as things like waterproof windows and doors to prevent water essentially from getting inside, causing damage. So the map on the right essentially shows all of the reaches throughout the watershed and how we aggregated non-structural measures. Each reach has a code associated with it. The code isn't really important for the discussion today. What I want to do is highlight those reaches that are circled in green. So those are reaches for initial comparison purposes that had positive economic benefits associated with the non-structural measures in those reaches. And so for the purposes of initial comparison, we just wanted to look at those reaches, again, understanding that that would maximize economic benefits. And if, depending on how competitive this alternative was, we could add other reaches that might, be in more socially vulnerable areas to maximize other benefits as well. But for the initial comparison, we were just looking at the economic benefits. And so you can see that in those 6 reaches alone, we had elevating about 200 residential structures, and then dry flood proofing about 1,800 non-residential structures. It's important to note that under these types of plans, elevation and flood proofing are not mandatory, and so it would be up to the individual property owner as to whether or not they took part in the final plan. So this slide essentially is just showing a comparison matrix of all the alternatives and the different benefits that we looked at. So we'll kind of walk across the benefits at the top. Historically, the Army Corps of Engineers justified project based off of what we call the National Economic Benefits or the National Economic Development Plan. However, recently, we have been directed to take into consideration what we call comprehensive benefits. So incorporating benefits like other social effects, regional economic development, and environmental considerations. And so the remainder of these benefit categories are essentially meant to kind of see how each plan captures benefits across the full range of those benefit categories. They include impacts to commerce and tourism. Again, this is one of our objectives. Life safety risk reduction. Again, this is one of our objectives. Regional economic benefit. So when we construct and maintain these types of facilities, it creates jobs and brings in regional revenue. So we take that into consideration. One thing that we looked at was how much each plan benefited areas identified as socially vulnerable using tools like the Social Vulnerability Index, and again, also environmental considerations. So if we just kind of walk through each of these categories, we'll start with national economic benefits. We see that all plans had positive economic benefits. However, alternative 5, the hybrid plan, had the greatest. With respect to impacts to commerce and tourism, we looked at individual reaches that had areas that are important for commerce and tourism, like the Ala Moana neighborhoods, the Waikiki district, the Manoa Marketplace, and looked at how flood elevations were reduced and risk was reduced in those reaches. And again, alternative 5 had the greatest benefit in those reaches. Alternative 5 also had the greatest reduction to life safety risk. It had the greatest regional economic development benefit, and it also reduced flood risk in the most socially vulnerable areas the most. Alternative 6 would be least impactful to the environment. However, alternatives 1 and 5 were also minimally impactful and would not have significant effects if we implemented mitigation measures. And so if we just kind of look at this holistically, we see that alternative 5 represents both the National Economic Development Plan, meaning the plan that maximizes those economic benefits, but it also represents what we call the Comprehensive Benefits Plan, or the plan that maximizes benefits across all categories. So we wanted to dive into alternative 5 a little bit further. The next step is to do what we call incremental justification. So we have the best plan, but the question is each individual component of that plan justified? And so what we did is we looked at things individually or separately as much as we could. And we ran a series of model runs, basically pulling out these features and rerunning it and looking at how well we reduce flood risk and kind of the economic benefits associated with that revised plan. And ultimately found out that both the Makiki District Park and associated Kanaha floodwall and the Manoa Valley District Park were not incrementally justified. Now, they did have benefit. It's just that benefit, whether it be economic or through other means, was not enough to warrant its inclusion in the overall project. However, the Woodlawn Bridge flood wall and the flood wall at the Manoa-Palolo confluence, those were justified, as was the flood walls along the Manoa-Palolo Canal and Alawai Canal, as well as the Alawai Detention Basin. So all of those features were justified, meaning that the net benefits that they accrued were enough to kind of justify the costs that it would take to implement those features. So after removal of those features that were not incrementally justified, we have what we're calling today is the prospective plan. And again, it is the flood wall at the Woodlawn Bridge, the flood wall at the confluence of the Manoa-Palolo streams, the flood walls around the Alawai Canal and the Manoa-Palolo Canal, and then the detention basin at the Alawai Golf Course. Now, again, I noted earlier that the flood walls are all assumed to be 6 feet in height. That height will be the height of those features will be optimized again moving forward through the study. So again, we're not calling this today the tentatively selected plan, which is what will be released in the draft report, because we are still undergoing some analysis. And the next slide kind of details what those analyses are. So the first is potential incorporation of non-structural measures. So there are areas in the plan that are currently not benefited by the measures that are in the plan. And so we're looking at, can non-structural measures be applied in those areas to reduce that residual or remaining risk? We're also considering kind of minor modifications to the features that are in the plan. So for example, modifying the alignment of the flood wall, or potentially the addition of some interior pumps to help with drainage. As we've discussed in previous studies, we're also, now that we have a better handle on what the plan will be, taking a much stronger look at aesthetics of these features. So yeah, I guess aesthetics and other social implications, right? So looking at how can we incorporate features or in the areas of the canoe launches, how can we modify the facade of the flood wall to minimize visual impacts? And then also we're still considering an elevated path, elevated walkway, running biking path behind the flood wall. Again, it might be elevated 3 feet so that you have a 3-foot elevated walkway and a 3-foot wall on top of that. So again, we'll have all those ways to mitigate those impacts kind of incorporated into the draft report. In addition to those technical analyses, we're going to undergo internal technical reviews. Then we will be reaching out directly now that we have a better handle on what this plan looks like, to those landowners potentially affected by the plan prior to the release of the draft report. So I'd like to switch gears a little bit now to the National Environmental Policy Act process. So I think a lot of folks have probably heard that we did switch from an environmental assessment to an environmental impact statement. And I have kind of the language, the legal policy, regulatory language for each of those identified here, but kind of in a nutshell, environmental assessments are executed for projects that are less environmentally impactful. Under the environmental assessment process, neither public scoping nor public review of the draft document are required. However, I want to note that in the Army Corps, it is general practice to still undergo that scoping and that public review process for the draft report. And then there's also no requirement for publishing the draft or final environmental assessment. Now, under an environmental impact statement, these are generally executed for projects that have significant that could have significant environmental impacts. And because of those significant impacts, early scoping is required so that the public is engaged early in the study process. And as part of that, the draft and final environmental impact statements must be published with a full public notice and comment period. So those are just a few key differences between the EA and the EIS process. Now, the study team, in coordination with USACE's leadership, switched our compliance pathway from an environmental assessment to what we're calling a supplemental environmental impact statement. Well, not what we're calling, what is a supplemental environmental impact statement. I'll define, kind of go into what it means that it's a supplemental environmental impact statement on the next slide. But the reasons we switched were a few-fold. One is that environmental impact statements require additional time, right? There's additional requirements associated with environmental impact statements. And so if we wait too long to trigger transitioning from an EA environmental assessment to an environmental impact statement, that can ultimately delay the study. And so we have to kind of juggle, right? Does it make sense to trigger? Does it not, based off of what our perceived or understood impacts are at the time? At the time that we made that transition, there were still a number of measures in the formulation process that would have significant environmental impacts, primarily associated with direct ocean outlets. So because we were kind of reaching that timeline to where we needed to switch, if we were going to switch to an environmental impact statement without overall impacts to the study schedule, we ended up switching because, again, we had those features that would have environmental impacts. However, I'll say, and also switching to an EIS does have benefits, right, of overall transparency with the public, right? So, I mean, that's extremely important. So ultimately, we made the decision to switch for those reasons, right? We wanted to minimize impacts to the schedule. We still had some features in there that would be impactful, and we wanted to be transparent. So after we switched to environmental impact statement, all of those features that would have significant environmental impacts were either screened from further consideration, or we could avoid or minimize their impacts so that they weren't significant through certain application of certain measures. And at that point, we had a discussion internally as to whether or not it made sense to go back to an EA. And again, this all happened very fast. And at the time, Army Corps leadership said, well, let's keep, right, we are already on this pathway and it's more transparent. Let's keep on the EIS path. So when that decision was made, we published a notice of intent per policy and regulation to prepare an EIS in the Federal Register. It was a misstep on our part not to put out a public announcement or a public notice associated with that notice of intent. So what this notice of intent does is it initiates through the NEPA process the formal public scoping period. It's a 30-day public comment period. Again, because we didn't put out that kind of notice to the community through public release, we decided, and again, based off your feedback, which we really appreciate, we decided to extend that public comment period to 8 May, ensuring that everybody had the full opportunity to provide comments. At the same time that we're undergoing the NEPA process, so the National Environmental Policy Act, there's the Hawaii Environmental Policy Act. And so very similarly, right, we have to publish a notice of intent to prepare an EIS within the environmental notice, which is a state publication, for a comment period as well. And so the two key things from this slide now that we're going to talk about are what's a supplemental EIS, and then, what does it mean for the public scoping period? So the reason this is a supplemental EIS is that there was an environmental impact statement that was executed as part of the 2017 feasibility report. And so that environmental impact statement and the alternatives that were looked at therein incorporated all of the kind of measures that are in the green circle of the Venn diagram. So that once we decided we needed to trigger an EIS, we looked at we saw that there was overlap, right, with the original EIS and the measures that we had in our final array as well. And so instead of going back and redoing all of that work, we decided that we could execute a supplemental EIS, being more efficient with funding, using the analyses in that original EIS, and then adding analyses as needed to capture those, I apologize, those measures that were not in that original EIS. And so again, supplementary EIS just allows us to take the analyses as appropriate that were executed under the original EIS and then add to them as necessary to cover everything that we're proposing. Now, with respect to scoping, again, I have the regulatory language written here, but I just highlighted a few areas. And so again, the notice of intent starts that scoping period. And so basically what this says is agencies shall use an early and open process to determine the scope of issues for an analysis in an EIS. Scoping may begin as soon as practicable, and it may include appropriate pre-application procedures or work conducted prior to the publication of the notice of intent. And the purpose of this slide is really to say that we have engaged the public, you all, through the entire scoping process. And so I just am showing here kind of the timeline of public involvement, public meetings that we have had, right, that you all have been able to participate into within that scoping process. And so, although, what I'll say is because we're doing a supplemental EIS, right, our EIS, supplemental EIS will cover and incorporate comments that were received during the original EIS, the original studies, comments that were received during workshops prior to the publishing of the notice of intent, comments received during the 30-day, the currently ongoing 30-day public comment period associated with the publishing of the notice of intent, and then also comments received, when we release the draft and final public comments, as well as any additional meetings that we have. And the important thing is that they're all equally considered, right? And so, again, because we've tried to be transparent and open with you all throughout the scoping process, again, all of these are covered under that scoping period. So what's the NEPA process look like with respect to the study schedule? So again, we published the notice of intent in the Federal Register back in on February 22nd. That comes with a 30-day scoping period that was extended to May 8th. And it really kicks off that scoping process, even though, as I just mentioned, we've been in a scoping process essentially since the initiation of the study in our first public meeting back in November. We're also working to prepare the draft EIS, and about the June-July timeframe, as I mentioned, we'll release the draft report and the draft supplemental EIS for public review. At that time, we will publish a notice of availability in the Federal Register. And unlike last time, we will make sure that we provide a public announcement associated with that notice of availability. Once we release the draft report, or I guess I'll say in association with the release of the draft report, we're going to hold 2 public meetings, one in person and one virtual, again, hopefully around the June-July timeframe, where again, it just kind of it's part of that open public comment period. After that review and all of our internal reviews, we'll revise the report, finalize the report, and then ultimately publish a notice of availability in the Federal Register of the final report. And again, we will notify the public via multiple pathways of that notice of availability. After that, we'll complete and release the record of decision. The state will make an acceptability determination of kind of the results found in the environmental impact statement. And then ultimately the study will be, the study will end hopefully with a recommendation for implementation. So what does that mean with respect to kind of our study timeline that we've been presenting all along? Again, so on the bottom line here, all of the little circles represent public meetings that we've had. I think this is our 11th meeting. And again, all of those kind of are part of that scoping period that has been ongoing. We are planning on completing and releasing the draft report again around the May-June timeframe, which would have a public meeting around the June-July timeframe. Again, we'll have 2 public meetings, one in person and one virtual, associated with the release of the draft report and that 45-day public review period of the draft report. We'll finalize the report, incorporate all of the comments, necessary changes, and then ahead of the release of the final report and environmental impact statement, we will have another meeting with the public where we talk about what will be released in that final report. We'll release the final report and then have one final public engagement to kind of obtain feedback and discuss the remaining timeline. So that essentially concludes my technical piece, my longer technical piece. Again, we'll provide a much more brief kind of overview of this information on April 24th during the actual meeting. But between now and then, and even after that meeting, there are multiple ways to always provide feedback online via the contact form at the website at the top, directly to the study email that is shown there. Mailing directly hard copies of comments to the address you can see in the middle of the screen. And with respect to the next upcoming public meeting, again, it's going to be April 24th at 5:30 p.m. It will be virtual. The link is provided there. The link will also be provided online, and is also available in the public release that was sent out, public announcement that was sent out a few days ago, or I guess last week. You just click on the link, and then you can use your computer audio and video to join. You can also, if you just have a phone, you can call in via the number shown there using the access code below. Again, I appreciate your time and your interest in looking ahead at this video in preparation of that meeting, and really look forward to the discussion at that meeting. So thank you all. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk soon.